This video brings you a step-by-step tutorial for a dress. This is a free pattern which you can download from our site. This is important. This pattern is free and will get added to your patterns section under your login where you can find and download it from. I'm not going into detail about how to choose your size or how to print and assemble your paper pattern. All this information and more can be found in your instructions. Let's move on to cutting and sewing. We are now moving on to unboxing our fabric before we start cutting out our dress. I have here our main fabric, threads, including threads for lining fabric, some swatches, and elastic. For the main fabric, I chose this 100% cotton dusty yellow broderie anglaise, and for the lining, I also use 100% cotton fabric. You can see that these fabrics are different shades of yellow, and I've done that on purpose. If both fabrics were exactly the same color, the beautiful texture of broderie anglaise would get lost. I like the effect of having the lining fabric a little lighter than the main fabric. But it's my preference, you don't have to do the same. Before you start cutting, you have to pre-treat your fabric so that it doesn't shrink during the sewing process and the first wash. Steam pressing the fabric should be done from the wrong side. Speaking of which, if you are using broderie anglaise, check the texture of the fabric on both sides. Most likely, it will look different on the right and wrong sides of the fabric. On the right side, it will be more pronounced and textured. I folded my fabric right sides in and will be going over it with an iron on a high steam setting quite generously. First over one side, then over the other side, and then over the folded area. Please do not skip this step. And now we're going to steam press the lining fabric in exactly the same way. We will be cutting on a single layer. It means your fabric is lying flat as opposed to folded in half. And the wrong side is facing up. Start laying out the biggest pattern pieces first. For this dress, it will be the flounce pieces. Please note that the pattern pieces should be positioned according to the grain line direction indicated on the pattern. My fabric has quite a small pattern repeat, so there's no need to pattern match. However, if your fabric has a larger print, you would have to incorporate that into your process. But it wouldn't be too difficult as we are only working with one layer of fabric. Also, another important thing. On some pattern pieces, you will see cut 1, and some others will say cut 2. If it says to cut one piece, you just do that. If it tells you to cut 2 pieces, you cut the first piece with the paper pattern writing side up, and then turn the paper over and have the blank side of the pattern up. Don't forget to double check the grain line direction. I'm doing it with my ruler. Measure the distance between the grain line arrow on the pattern and the selvage line. The measurement should be the same along the entire pattern piece. To make the cutting more accurate, make sure to pin the paper pattern to the fabric. Just to remind you that all seam allowances are already included in your pattern, so you don't need to add anything. By the way, don't be in a rush to unpin the pattern from the fabric once it's cut. We still have to transfer the markings onto it. For example, we need to transfer the darts onto the front bodice piece. I like to do it this way. Cut one dart leg open and trace over the other leg with something blunt so that it's easy to crease along that line. I transfer the marks with chalk. I think you will find chalk easy to use with this kind of fabric too. I transfer the second dart the same way. If you are working with, say, a flounce piece, don't forget to write with chalk on the wrong side of it, whether it's a front or a back flounce so that there's no confusion later. Don't forget to transfer the notches which you will see on your pattern as small perpendicular lines. Don't snip into the fabric too deep, the notches should be just a few millimeters. Pay attention to the pieces that need to be cut twice. Once you deal with the first piece and transfer all the markings, flip the paper pattern the other side up and cut out the second piece. Then you will have both the left and the right sides. So now we have the following pieces ready. 2 front bodice pieces, 2 back bodice pieces, two back neckline flounce pieces, and 2 front neckline flounce pieces. There is also 1 front skirt piece and 1 back skirt piece. And we have 1 back skirt flounce piece and 1 front skirt flounce piece. Also, we have 2 back tie pieces cut from the main fabric. Let's cut out the lining pieces. We are going to cut exactly in the same way as the main fabric, on a single layer with the wrong side facing up. From the lining fabric, we will cut the front and back bodice pieces as well as the front and back skirt pieces, and the arm side bias binding. While laying out the pattern pieces, make sure the grain line direction is followed precisely. Check with your ruler for accuracy. Pin and cut out the pieces. When cutting out the bias binding, pay attention to the direction of the grain line indicated on the pattern piece. On my fabric piece, the grain line is running this way, along the selvage. So I pin my bias binding pattern piece accordingly. We need to cut 2 arm side bias binding pieces. I will align my second piece parallel to the cut edge. So this is what we have cut from the lining fabric. Front and back skirt pieces, 1 of each. Front and back bodice pieces, 2 of each. And 2 arm side bias binding pieces. Cutting out is now done. Next, I am going to show you how to put this dress together. But don't forget that you will need to check the fit before you finish it. We are going to start with stitching the darts on the front bodice pieces. First, pin them closed. I do advise basting them before stitching on your machine. When you are pinning your darts, check both sides of fabric to ensure they are evenly pinned. Turn the fabric over before you put the pin through, that will help the accuracy. Before you go to your sewing machine to do the stitching, insert a pin perpendicular to the point of the dart. You can compare them to see that the darts are the same length. Backstitch at the wide end of the dart, then keep going along the chalk line. And do not backstitch at the end of the seam. Leave the threads free. Tie the loose threads at the point of the dart with a double knot. Then thread these 2 ends through a needle and hide them in the dart bulk. Put the needle through as close to the dart point as you can, and pull it through the dart bulk for about 1 to 1.5 centimeters. It will hide the ends of the threads. This is what it should look like at this point. We stitched the darts. Let's go and press them flat first, then press them to the side. Don't press outside the dart area. The bust dart will be pressed upwards. I'll press it some more from the right side. The waist dart will be pressed towards the center front. This is when a tailor's hem comes in handy. It will help shrink out the fullness in the area between the dart points. You can use a wooden clapper if you have one, to set the dart's shape in place. The garment is rather fitted, so the darts are quite wide. In larger sizes, this bust dart can become quite big and noticeable from the right side. So it would be a good idea to trim this dart seam allowance, leaving it 1 centimeter wide. I could have easily left my dart as it was, but I can also trim it like this. It leaves us with an approximately 1 cm dart seam allowance. The bodice will be lined, so there is no need to finish this dart seam allowance on the overlocker, we will just leave it as it is. Now we need to join the front and back bodice pieces along the shoulder seams. To do this, place the front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin. It will be fine to just pin the shoulder edges together before stitching. I wouldn't worry about basting such small and straight seams. I also suggest joining the neckline flounce pieces along the shoulder seams. Take the front and back neckline flounce pieces, place them right sides together and pin. Same for the other pair. Now machine stitch the shoulder seams we just pinned on the bodice and flounce pieces. Stitch at 1 cm from the edge. Press the seams flat on the bodice and flounce pieces. Then press the seam allowances open. If we had a different type of fabric, we could have overlocked the seam allowances at this stage. But we have an eyelet pattern here, so it wouldn't look right. We turn the seam allowance under and stitch over the folded edge. We are going to stitch at approximately 1 to 2 mm from the folded edge. Don't forget to press all seams. So here we have the bodice pieces and the flounce pieces joined along the shoulder seams. Now we are moving on to finishing the bottom edges of the flounces. This is the edge we will be working on. There are several finishing options. If we were working with fabric without holes in it, we could have overlocked the edge and folded it under or used a rolled hem. Since I have this broderie anglaise fabric, I will be using a different method. I will be finishing this edge in 2 steps. First of all, I'll go to my sewing machine and stitch as I'm folding approximately 5 mm of the hem allowance to the wrong side. I am folding the raw edge like this, and to prevent my sewing machine from getting stuck at the beginning of the seam, I will not start right at the top but go slightly further in. I will be stitching at approximately 2 to 3 mm from the folded edge, and I will not backstitch so that the machine doesn't get a chance to bunch up the thread. If you find it difficult to stitch as you fold, of course you can baste the edge in place first, but it will take you slightly longer. Now we need to press the seam we just stitched. And now we take our time and trim the extra seam allowance down to 1 mm, very carefully. Next, we go back to our sewing machine, turn the edge over again and stitch it in place. This way, we will finish the bottom edge of the flounce. Since it's the second seam, and the edge is now reinforced, we have a much tidier seam this time. Go over the thicker area very carefully. Use your fingers to help feed it through. Take your time with it. Press the second seam. Now we need to sew 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top edges of both flounces. One will be at 1 cm from the edge, and the other one at about 5 mm from the edge. Use a 4 to 5 mm stitch length. This edge will be gathered later on. It's very important not to backstitch, but leave long thread tails at the beginning and end of this seam to aid with the gathering. My first line of stitching is running at approximately 1 cm from the edge. I move my needle to the right so that the second seam is at about 5 mm from the edge. And we start stitching again. Now take 1 set of joined front and back bodice pieces and also the flounce. We will be pulling on the bobbin thread so that we could create the gathers on our flounce. And we can check the gathered edge against the length of the neckline. Start gathering. Try not to break the threads, as you would have to start the process all over again. I gathered the flounce, but it looks a little short for the neckline. Let's adjust it very gently. It will be easier to do if we pin the shoulder seam of the flounce to the seam joining the front and back bodice pieces. Let's check by how much we need to loosen the flounce gathering. I am letting it out a little bit. Our aim right now is to make these edges equal in length. I think that this is going to be enough. When your edges are even, tie the loose threads to secure the gathers. Now I suggest distributing the gathers evenly along the seam. Here I have already matched the front neckline flounce to the front bodice, and I can pin it along the neckline. The same should be done along the back neckline. But while we're here, we can pin the two pieces along the center front seam as well. And take care of this side of the neckline as well, evening it out with your hands. Then do the same at the back. I only have to adjust the gathering a little bit. Don't forget to tie the knots at the end to secure the gathers. It will be nice if you can try it on yourself or your dress form and check if the gathers are looking evenly distributed, and whether you like the way they sit. One thing is to see it flat on the table, and another thing is to see it in action, and sometimes those could be two different things. Perhaps you would like to move the gathering towards the top in this area. Now attach the neckline flounce to the front and back bodice pieces. Do it with one seam and stitch at 1 centimeter from the edge. Here we will have to pivot. Make sure your needle is in the down position when you do that. Rotate the pieces and continue stitching. You can still adjust the gathers as you go. Of course, press the seam. Do it very carefully and don't go over to the flounce area. Now we have to join these pieces along the center front seam. Put them right sides together and then machine stitch. The seam will start 1 centimeter away from the neckline edge. Keep that 1 centimeter free. Also, join the bodice pieces along the side seams. I am stitching along the side seams and the center front seam. Just to remind you that we start stitching the center front seam 1 centimeter below the neckline edge. Press the side seam allowances open. As you can tell, I am doing this on the sleeve board, and it makes it easier. Don't overlock these seam allowances because everything will be covered with the lining. Carefully spread the center front seam allowances and press them open. Also, check whether there are any creases on the right side. If you see some, then iron them out. This is what it should look like at this point. I think it's gorgeous, such a beautiful back. Now take the tie pieces and fold each of them lengthwise, right sides together. Pin and machine stitch along the short slanted edge and the long edge. Leave the straight short edge open for turning the tie out. Trim the seam allowances down to approximately 5 millimeters. To have pretty corners on the ties, clip the corners of the seam allowances. Leave about 1 to 2 millimeters uncut. Now let's turn out the tie with the help of a pencil or a pen. Just be careful not to leave marks on your fabric. Straighten out the corners carefully. Use a pin to aid with that, but be careful not to pull too much fabric out of the seam. And don't make it too pointy. Try to make both ties look identical. Now hand baste the tie along the stitched sides, with the seam right on the edge. It's necessary to keep the ties tidy and straight. Make sure your seams are not disappearing in by rolling them with your fingers. I am using a straight basting stitch as this fabric is rather lightweight, and it will be enough. I suggest pressing the ties before taking them to the sewing machine. It will help with keeping the seam very straight. I increased the stitch length to 3 mm, but you might prefer a different setting. I also moved my needle to the right so that my seam runs at about 5 mm from the edge. Top stitch along the 3 sides of the tie. We are approaching the area where we will need to pivot. To prevent the machine from chewing up the corner, I pull a double thread through the corner with a needle, and now I have my little helpers to aid through the difficult part. As you reach the corner, put your needle down, pivot the tie. And the thread comes in handy at this point. Pull the fabric through, very slightly and gently. You can do the same with the next corner if you like. After removing the basting stitches, give the ties another good press and shape them as they cool down. The ties are ready, and we can attach them to the bodice of the dress. Double-check that they are positioned symmetrically. For example, I decided to position the sharp corners at the top. So one tie will go here, and the other one will go on the other side in the same way. At the bottom, again, leave 1 centimeter free so that you can attach it to the skirt. Place and pin the tie. Do the same on the other side. Then take it to the sewing machine and secure it in place. Stitch at 1 centimeter from the edge. You can put the bodice of the dress away for now. Let's proceed to sew the skirt. Let's move on to sewing the skirt of the dress. I have the front and back skirt pieces here, and we need to finish the side edges. This needs to be done prior to joining them together. To finish the edges, we will need 2 strips of fabric, about 2.5 centimeters wide. My ruler is conveniently that exact width, which helps with marking. We will be cutting the strips out of the lining fabric, which has to be rather thin so that it's easy to work with. Let's cut a few 2.5 centimeter wide strips on the cross grain. Here we don't need to cut on the bias as our edges are straight. Cut out the strips. When you cut your lining strips, make sure they are long enough to cover one edge. Now the skirt piece is lying right side up. And I am positioning the binding strip right side down. Let's attach the binding strip to the skirt piece on the sewing machine. Stitch at about 5 mm from the edge. If you don't like stitching over the pins, you can hand baste this seam prior to machining it. Press the seam flat. By the way, don't trim the extra bits at the ends yet. They will be useful to us when we are concealing the raw edge. Now fold and press the binding strip towards the raw edge. We want the binding seam to look tidy and nice. So I suggest trimming the seam allowances by a couple of millimeters. Leave about 3 millimeters untouched. It will help avoid having extra bulk in there. Fold the binding strip edge under, like this, and fold it over the raw edge. Make sure that this side of the strip is about 1 millimeter lower than the seam that joins the binding strip to the skirt piece. And of course, we now need to baste it in place. When you are basting, try to catch the binding strip on the other side as well. You can feel the edge of it with your fingers. Finish all the skirt side edges the same way. This is what it should look like. Let's take it to the sewing machine for stitching. In order to facilitate sewing a beautiful seam 1 to 2 millimeters away from the folded edge, I am attaching a stitch in the ditch presser foot. It will help keep my seam super straight. In order to hide any possible visible flaws in the seam, let's stitch on the right side of the piece. This way, any little flaw won't be visible after pressing the seam allowances open. I moved the needle to the right because my machine has a function that allows doing that, and I am starting to sew now. Remove the basting stitches and give the seam a nice press. This is what it looks like from both sides after pressing. Now we can trim the extra bits at the ends. Next, we need to join the front and back skirt pieces along the side seams. The important thing to remember is that we will be starting the seam 1 centimeter away from the top edge. That will be 1 centimeter down from the edge, here. Press the side seam allowances open. This is what it should look like at this stage. Let's put the skirt away for now and look at the skirt flounce. Here we do exactly what we did with the neckline flounce. First, join the flounce pieces along the side seams, carefully hide the seam allowances. Then finish the hem with 2 seams. Next, sew 2 parallel lines of gathering stitches along the top edge of the flounce, at 1 centimeter and 5 millimeters from the edge. Use a 5 millimeter stitch length. Do not backstitch and leave long thread tails for gathering. Then gather the top edge of the flounce. By the way, it will be more convenient to start stitching not right on top of the side seam but past it a little. The gathering will look more even, and there will be no bulk over the thicker area. The length of the top edge of the gathered flounce should be equal to the length of the bottom edge of the skirt. Be careful not to mix up the front flounce and the back flounce when matching them up to the skirt. In order to match the edges, you can pin them at the side seams. Then you can tighten or loosen the gathers a little where needed. Before starting to pin the pieces together, try to distribute the gathers evenly along each side. Make sure the gathers are not tighter in some areas as compared to the others. After evening out the gathers, continue pinning the flounce to the skirt. There are notches at the center front and center back, so you can use them to help you. Here I have a center of the flounce and a center of the skirt piece, and I am now pinning the 2 notches together. Next, I pin the area between the side seam and the center notch. Now let's join the flounce to the skirt. Try to stitch over the second gathering stitching line, at 1 centimeter from the edge. Control the gathers as you are stitching so that everything looks even and pretty. Then press the seam flat carefully. Make sure you don't press the flounce itself. Don't forget to set the seam, which you can actually do with a simple wooden ruler. The main thing is that we make these gathered areas as flat as we can. This seam allowance can be finished on the overlocker. If you are using a different fabric and you didn't use binding on your side seam allowances, you can easily use the overlocker here. Since I have already started binding the seam allowances, I will apply the same finish here. I have cut this strip on the cross grain, not on the bias, and I will use it to bind the seam allowances. Here we have two things to remember. First of all, I suggest you not start right over the side seam as it already has extra bulk. Let's move slightly off the side seam. Another thing is that I didn't fold the binding strip like this accidentally. We should start the seam with the end of the strip folded this way so that we join the ends in a nice way. You can either baste the strip first or start stitching straight away, whichever is more convenient. If your strip is not long enough, you can piece it together from 2 or more cuts. And I suggest trimming the seam allowances down to about 5 mm. Cut off the rest. I move the needle to the right again so that my seam is 5 mm away from the edge. I didn't even pin the strip. I will be matching the raw edges as I go. If your edge got tatty by this point, you can trim the loose threads before applying the binding. When you approach the beginning of the seam, here is what you should do. Approximate how long you need the strip to be, and cut off the rest so that it covers the folded part by about 1.5 centimeters. Carry on stitching. Try to stitch over the first stitching line. Press the seam flat and trim the seam allowances a little. Then fold the binding over the seam allowances, like we did last time. And press it again. Now we are at the area with several layers of binding. Here is what you should do. Straighten both layers, fold them under together and place them over the seam. It will give us a very tidy finish. Hand baste it in place first, as you won't have a nice finish if you go straight to your machine. Of course, there's a bulk, and it's not a straightforward place here. But I am sure if you take your time, you will have a great result. It should look like this. Continue basting as normal for the rest of the seam. Next, stitch on the sewing machine. As we will press the seam allowances upwards, it is best to keep the flounce facing up when stitching. As always, I change to my favorite presser foot, but you can do it with the standard one. Perhaps it will even give you more room to maneuver. Turn the flounce downwards, the seam allowances should be facing upwards. Press it in place from the right side of the garment. Do not press the flounce. Next, top stitch to secure the seam allowances to the skirt. Usually the top stitching is done 3 to 5 mm away from the seam, but it's up to you. I will be staying fairly close to the seam. The stitch length should be increased to 3 mm. Just to remind you that the seam allowances are turned upwards, towards the skirt. And the seam we are stitching now is at the bottom of the skirt pieces. Now we can press the seam. Do it from the wrong side of the garment. Try not to press the flounce itself. We now have this beautiful finish on the inside of the skirt of our dress. When you are done with pressing, you can put the skirt away.